Welcome to Human Rights Asia Weekly Roundup. I'm Josephina Bergsten. In this week's program, we have a special focus on the discussions held during AHRC's partner meeting in Hong Kong last week. Human rights defenders from around Asia spent 5 days discussing important questions around their approach to human rights work. The discussions centered on the need to change some fundamental assumptions, which have been the basis for human rights work so far, such as assuming that their countries are rule of law countries. What is the basic normative framework under which these countries operate, and does it in fact qualify them to call themselves rule of law countries? Should they, as human rights defenders, continue to push for better implementation of some laws that are already in place, or do they in fact need to assume that the rule of law does not exist and in its place is a law and order system, a very different way of ruling a country? We will get a few glimpses from the meeting and also interview some of the participants.
Is your country a rule of law country? Now that is a question that you can slowly begin to think. It's of momentous importance to decide whichever way, because whichever way you decide will determine the kind of work you are going to do. Lot of work that is often doesn't go far enough is due not to the realization of this particular question. What are we?
Sometimes we confuse with this law and order and rule of law. So rule of law is the basic structure a country should have. And my impression is that for India, though we have that kind of a framework, but still that is not delivering towards the rule of law. So for civil society of India, very few people are talking about the rule of law actually. So now election is going on, and hardly you will find any civil society have raised this rule of law issue. Rather, poverty issue, development issue are discussed, but not discussed about the police reform, judiciary reform. So there is need to discuss more, debate more on this issue among civil society members and bringing a common understanding of a rule of law.
People in the governments, like especially the senators or the lawmakers, and even in the judiciary, they always talk about the rule of law. And they are doing this and that because they are upholding the rule of law. So I think in somehow the discussion will provide an element to question that concept, their concept of the rule of law. And then we could just say, and then when we say, oh, what kind of rule of law are you talking about,
By what yardstick can you say whether we are a rule of law country or whether we are not? Now, as far as human rights are concerned, the yardstick we use is called norms. What is the standard regarding equality? This is the primary measure of respect for human rights. How is equality treated?
Cambodia is in a situation which is far away from the concept of rule of law that we are discussing right now. The rule of law is something that we should do a system of governance to promote and respect for the basic right and fundamental freedom, something like this. But in Cambodia, they don't do so, and that's why the Phnom Penh administration under the current government, they put the very strict bans against the freedoms of assembly, freedom of assembly for expressions of opinion, something like that. So this is a serious or a big contradiction to the concepts of rules of law. So it needs to be done more for the improvement, the situation of rule of laws in Cambodia.
Individual freedom is not measured by freedom, right? Abstract idea called freedom. it is measured by whether you can be arrested for only for crime investigations or punishment. If you can be arrested for anything else, then that is not a free society. Is torture being completely eliminated in dealing of the individual with the state? If it is eliminated, then like the pound or a rupee or you have the standard of freedom. If you don't, to that extent, you also have deterioration of freedom, lack of freedom. So freedom is measured by torture. So torture is not just about torture. Torture is about freedom. You can't have torture and freedom. In a country, you can't have torture and freedom. If you have torture, to that extent, there is no freedom.
As a human rights defender like me, it is very dangerous because in our place, Mindanao, is mostly our strong militarization. If you are against the government, you are now threat to death. Yes, and if you are educating the people in the community about their rights, you are also a threat. Yes, why you are doing that and why you are teaching the people like this and like that.
A judge who is legitimate is a person who, first of all, he derives his power from a branch of a separate branch of law, a separate branch of the government. That's called judiciary. So if there is no separation of powers, there cannot be a judge. This is very fundamental. You know, you can examine into your countries back into. If there is no separation of powers, there can't be judges.
So now the government, the Rajapaksa regime, they control every aspect of life, institution, all institutions. So they personally, they interfere with judges, other officers, all administration officers, not only in courts, even in the local government, in the lowest level government officer, they have to listen them.
I think that's the main challenge is actually that you are working in an environment which is very repressive environment, and you work in a country which is actually a country full of violence. So you have a violence on each and every step of your work as well. And this, unfortunately, this violence you face is not only on the part of the state, but now we have a large number of non-state actors that are involved in the violence. So working in a violent country is one of the challenge. And second is also you work in an environment in a country where you don't really have a rule of law. It's a country actually run without rule of law, and a country kind of operating in a chaos. So that's a second challenge actually. And the honest answer is that the basic governance system is actually dysfunctional. This whole system of a kind of law enforcement that should take into account of these issues, that how the police is going to operate, how you are going to arrest criminals, if torture is allowed or not, and to what degree you can investigate people. So that's a complete breakdown within the police system actually.
For there to be a respect for human rights, there has to be an agreement on what is improper use of force and violence. If you do this, it is not proper, it's not correct. There has to be a common agreement, and there has to be an agreement particularly in the government. If the government has the two standards on that, then that is a very serious problem. If you think that under certain circumstances we can allow extrajudicial killings, under certain circumstances we can allow anybody to be arrested and detained, or we can allow certain sexual abuse under certain circumstances. This is very important in deciding what kind of society and what kind of government is it. Is it a rule of law based government, or is it based on something else? If the government has different standards, different norm about improper use of force and violence, they are basing themselves in a different philosophy than from the philosophy of the rule of law.
Human rights are absolute, and human rights violations, if they are committed by the institutions, public institutions, by the state, that means this is all happening to just to consolidate their own powers, and they are considering the torture, the enforced disappearances, the extrajudicial killings, the arbitrary arrest. It means they are using these things as a tool to govern the common people. They are using these brutal acts just to consolidate their own powers, and they consider themselves and their institutions where they are representing, they are above the law, and they finally enjoy the culture of impunity.
In doing things, there can be a difference of degree. That is, somebody breaks the rule, but the agreement is that is wrong. So then you can enforce it. You can immediately enforce it. But you think torture can be used for criminal investigations, right? And then you don't agree with the norm itself. So how can you enforce it? There will always be, whatever the norm, there can be variation. Somebody breaks it. Even in society, we all agree rape is wrong, right? But somebody goes and rape, but then we can punish him. By punishment, we can correct it. But if there's no agreement, how do you correct it by punishment?
When I was reminded that sometimes the government told us that in a religious conflict, specifically, that the law is in the secondary priorities of the government. The first priority of the government is to maintain order. So it comes to my mind that such a illustration reflects that the Indonesia, up until now, can be considered as a rule by law instead of rule of law countries.
Is your system a rule of law system? With some defects, okay? Or is it not a rule of law system at all? This is very important because, in influencing society, what matters is clarity. If we have half a mind about something, we really don't know, or we don't make up our mind. Yeah, there's some small thing wrong, let's try to correct that. And if you work on that basis, then you don't touch many people, because people know the problems are much deeper.
Before our coming to these meetings, we don't know systematically what is the rules of law system. And after the 4 days meetings, we understanding about the rules of law. So when we arrive back in Burma, so we need to lobby awareness to the public about the rules of law.
We are trying to look back to a system in Sri Lanka that was working. We do not say that we never had rule of. We
we had rule of law, a system that was working. There was justice being delivered. And, but of course, we ourselves, I mean, our own leaders or the politicians who destroyed that system. So right now, actually, there is no system that is working. So with regard to rule of law, so at finally, I mean, there is no justice being delivered. So, but that doesn't mean that there is no future, because we know that there was a system, but we know how it was being purposely broken down.
That is all for this week's Human Rights Asia Weekly Roundup. For more information, log on to www.humanrights.asia. Thank you for watching, and see you again next week.